Saj. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. Very excited to have as my guest today, Saj Razvi. Saj, welcome.
Hi, Guy. Thank you for having me.
All right. So Saj is the Director of Education at Innate Path. He was a clinical researcher in a MAPS phase 2 trial of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder. His primary focus is on the wide-scale adoption and accessibility of psychedelic therapy through training therapists to work with cannabis and ketamine-assisted therapy in private practice settings. He's taught trauma studies as faculty at the University of Denver, as well as being a national topic expert for PESI education seminars focusing on complex PTSD. All right, Saj, welcome once again. So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you're calling from now.
You mean where I grew up?
Yes.
Yeah, I grew up in Maryland on the East Coast, right outside of DC, and I'm kind of based in Denver at times. And when it gets cold, I decide to go other places. So I'm in Phoenix, Arizona right now.
Okay, nice. All right, so let's start off first by giving our listeners an orientation of Innate Path, and then I want to talk about how you got into this field in the first place. So let's start there.
Great. Well, let me clarify something here. So Innate Path was our clinical organization that we founded in Denver after I was part of the MDMA, the MAPS MDMA phase 2 trials for treatment-resistant PTSD. And we founded Innate Path because we wanted to get more clinical experience, and more of an understanding of what legal psychedelics look like in a therapeutic setting. So we at Innate Path, we worked with both ketamine and cannabis. But at this point, I am the director of education at PSI, which is Psychedelic Somatic Institute. So that's basically Innate Path is still what it is, which is a clinical organization, and PSI is our spin-off where we're taking a lot of what we developed at Innate Path and we're running trainings at this point.
Awesome. Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah.
All right, go. So how did you share with our listeners how you got into this specialization, this interest?
You know, it was, so I got into the field probably the same way many clinicians get into the field, which is, we're wounded healers. We get into this because we're looking to work with our own insanity, our own reactivity, and we find it very interesting. Oh, I can see if I can shut that down here. Okay, can you still hear me okay?
Yes.
Hold on, I can't. Let me just turn off messages here, sorry. And I'll turn off WhatsApp. Turn off Signal. Okay.
No worries. We can edit that, so that's no worries.
Okay, got it. So yeah, that's how I started, and I realized fairly soon in that this was not just going to be an interesting academic pursuit, but it's going to be very personal. I realized that a lot of my core programming was very distorted, very off, didn't reflect the world that I lived in. My attachment was off in a pretty significant way. So I went through graduate school, and then I focused a lot on not just PTSD, but complex trauma, simply because it seemed to me that really was at the core of what a lot of people were coming in with. And as part of that, I found that, at least for me, having more insight, more understanding really did not change the reactivity that I found underneath it all. So the modalities that I was drawn to were much more somatic in nature. They were much more experiential in nature, with this idea that you can feel your way out of these places rather than think your way out of these places. And then in 2014, I interviewed for the position at MAPS with in the phase 2 MDMA trial. I did not have any real experience with psychedelics prior to that. And I knew about the history of it. I had done some reading about it, but I didn't have any direct experience.
So excuse me. So were you a clinician at this time? Were you a therapist at this time?
Yeah,
Okay.
so I finished up grad school in 2005, and then in 2008 we had a training organization that was really focused on training graduate students and clinicians how to work with PTSD through the body, through the autonomic nervous system. You know, this bottom-up processing
Right.
that is sort of coming along here. So, and I was doing that for a few years, and then, like I said, in 2014, that's when I interviewed for this position with MAPS. Um, and I think because of my background with trauma, I got it because of that. And I just, what led me to this, where I am today, really is what I saw in that clinical trial. Just, you know, what we could accomplish with the use of these medicines as an adjunct to psychotherapy, just to me was a game changer. To
Wow.
me,
So before you got that position, had you had experience using those substances clinically or
no,
therapeutically? Okay. Or
not at
recreationally?
all. Not even recreationally. I'd never taken MDMA before that. I didn't know much about it. I think at one point I had a very small experience with psilocybin mushrooms in a kind of an outdoor setting, which, by the way, was very useful therapeutically. Even after the fact, I kept being able to refer to that experience.
Interesting.
But yeah, but nothing before.
Okay. So you get this position. What transpired?
Well, I think I would see. So by at that point, I had been probably in the field in private practice for 9 years, and so I could tell. I had a sense of what we could accomplish in more traditional therapies, and even in sort of the more, I would say, cutting edge somatic experiential therapies, which I think are a significant improvement. Oh,
Hmm.
but we were still limited. We were still, you know, people had profound trauma leading all the way back to their childhood that, you know, would take years and years to really work with, and it took a lot of skill from the clinician, a lot of commitment and
Right.
time and energy from the client. And then what I saw was that in the MDMA trial, and since have seen with other medicines like ketamine and cannabis, is that these are fantastic accelerators of a person's process. You know, they are highly experience dependent, meaning the outcomes that we see with these medicines are really, really depend on the context in which they're used. They depend on the relational therapeutic interaction that takes place when in that state.
Set and setting.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
common one, the common understanding is set and setting, but I think what I would like to add to that picture is a sense of modality really does matter, and I think relationship really does matter as a component of set and setting.
Okay. So this is really interesting. There are so many things to talk about here. So let's kind of dive down a little bit, dive in a little bit. And I want to ask you what would the best way to illustrate how this works for
Mhm.
an individual?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna go with a little bit of neuroscience there and a little bit of anecdotal experience. So I think the best articulation I've heard of this is from a neuroscientist at Imperial College, Robin Carhart Harris, who's basically suggests that his research, you know, he places people in fMRI scanners and just looks at brain imaging while people are under the influence of different psychedelic medicines. And so what he's really coming to is this idea that we have inside of us the capacity for what's known as secondary consciousness and primary consciousness. Secondary consciousness is how your adult mind works at an ordinary way. Primary consciousness is a very different thing. It's much more mammalian. It's much more animalistic form of consciousness that doesn't do cognitive, you know, higher order cognitive thinking. It doesn't do abstract meaning making. It doesn't do any of those things. It's very visceral. It's very concrete. And the idea is, without going into the details here, the idea is that psychedelics, when taken, they disrupt your secondary conscious mind, meaning they disrupt the censorship and the control and the filtration system that your mind is ordinarily operating under, and they give you access to your primary consciousness, which is a much more um, in a way, it's a more chaotic form of consciousness, but it lets in much more information for us. And so, and then the basic idea is when we are in that primary consciousness state, we have a lot more access to memory, we have a lot more access to emotion, we have a lot more access to sensations and experiences that our ordinary waking mind normally filters out for us. And so therapeutically, that's incredibly useful, right? We have much less of that um, the blocks that a person's system normally puts up, the defenses, the dissociations, and things like that. They're still there in some way, but they can be worked with in a much more direct way and move through much more quickly, I think, in a psychedelic state.
Okay.
And guys, something I might suggest to your listeners, if they're interested in sort of the model that we're talking about here, we just published a paper at the Journal of Psychedelic Psychiatry. It's a peer-reviewed journal, and it sort of talks a lot about, I think, the model that you and I are going to be talking about today. And if they go to the psychedelicsomatic.org, we have a link to it.
Oh, great. Okay.
Page.
I'll link that up at the show notes page, psychedelicsomatic.org. Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, so we gain access to our consciousness and our emotions and our biology in a way we just don't have in secondary consciousness. And we find that there's a lot of homeostatic self-correction mechanisms that are in play there that get activated, that become boosted when in that psychedelic state.
Okay. Um, so someone comes to you, someone comes to receive this therapy. Walk us through how this might play out for them.
Okay. Um, well, again, it depends on what you're referring to, because MDMA is still not a legal medicine. It's moving through the FDA approval pipelines, and it will be. And it still remains to be seen what that's going to look like. My sense is that it's still going to be pretty heavily regulated by the FDA, since it is such a recreational drug,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be a drug of abuse at times. I don't know what the details of that are going to look like yet. And I don't know if anybody does. That's still kind of a conversation between MAPS and the FDA.
Okay.
What I can tell you about is how we work with ketamine and cannabis, which we're very excited about. You know, you think that cannabis is this very familiar drug. We don't appreciate it in mental health because it interrupts your executive functioning, and it interrupts your ability to tell the story and think clearly, which are all features of traditional psychotherapy. And I would say that they're features of secondary consciousness. But if you want an experience where people gain access to, again, their emotions and their body process, then I think something like cannabis can be actually a pretty excellent medicine for that. Again, not to calm anxiety, but to actually become a psychedelic excavation tool, right? So I'll say at this point, we would get people probably that have been through in the therapy system for 10, 15 years, and they've tried traditional psychiatric options, which are very frequently symptom management of what's going on. And I think people are looking for more than that at this point. And I think we can provide more at this point. Um, People would go through an application process. They have to apply. They have to demonstrate that they have enough stability in their life to work with this. Because something I'll be very clear about here, guys, is that psychedelic therapy is very destabilizing, right? It is not a magic pill that somebody takes and all of a sudden they feel better because it takes them to a wonderful place. That is not the case at all. This is true in every psychedelic therapy session I've ever been a part of, whether it's MDMA or cannabis, and I would even include ketamine with that, which is that it's taking you to your trauma. It's taking you to all the places that are very difficult, and the processing of it is very difficult, even with the support of these medicines. And so, people's coping mechanisms fall away, their defense mechanisms fall away, and so they're feeling much more raw during the process, even though they're very much supported. And then, particularly between sessions, people feel raw. I would say that, when working with people like this, you really need to have an eye out for sort of the level of resources that somebody has and how decompensated people can become.
So obviously, given what you said, then someone just doesn't walk into the office who's a good candidate and they're in this psychedelic session. I would imagine there is some lead up
Yeah.
to when they do process that. But what you said about this is taking them to the trauma and in a much more raw sense, it sounds like than they would otherwise be taken to the trauma in a traditional therapeutic session.
Yeah, absolutely. Because remember, when you're in secondary consciousness, you have control. Your mind is still in control. Many people who have trauma have very much don't have access to their bodies because I think we're much more able to control our thoughts than we are able to control our emotions or our body states. And so when people go into a psychedelic state, they lose that level of control that they've ordinarily had over their system.
So how then does the therapy work uh,
Yeah.
in that state with the therapist there who's guiding them?
Yeah. Well, here's an important piece, right? Because there's in traditional psychedelic therapy, ever since the 1950s, the model that's been used is much more of what we would call a sitter model, meaning that there's not a lot of interaction between the therapist and the participant. The participant is wearing eye shades, they have these headphones on, and really the magic is supposed to happen in interaction between the medicine and the participant's consciousness. And the therapists are only there really to make sure they're safe and help them to the bathroom or
Mhm.
hold somebody's hand if things get scary. There's not much interaction there. And I think the reason that is because, again, traditional talk therapy methods, insight work my sense is that it does not pair very well with the psychedelic state, right? So in other words, you're not doing reality testing. You're not, necessarily doing cognitive reframing, that kind of thing. Primary consciousness is much wilder than that. And so I think where we've landed is that, well, let's just do nothing and
Mhm.
let the magic happen in that scenario, and then a day later we'll do a psychedelic integration session, and then they can kind of unfold things and take things apart. And the suggestion that we have, the model that we've developed, which is called psychedelic somatic interactional psychotherapy, so PSIP, is saying, no, we think that we can do a lot more in that during the psychedelic session, but the interventions are not traditional talk therapy interventions. They're not insight-based interventions. They're much more organic nervous system processing based interventions. So what that looks like is, somebody goes into a psychedelic state and then their nervous system, their autonomic nervous system becomes much more active. The idea is that organically our systems do not want to hold on to trauma, right? We don't want to stay in these highly activated, hyper aroused or hypo aroused dissociated states. And when given the opportunity with enough support and entering the psychedelic state, which is one without the same sensors locking it down, we find that the body is much more able to begin the process,
Mm.
right? um, yeah, go ahead.
There's something that sounds really intense slash scary
Uh-huh.
slash amazing to me.
Yeah. Those are great words for describing what this is
Yeah.
about. Yeah, it is an uncontrolled experience, but I think what we find is there is a great deal of intelligence that people hold in terms of what they need in that moment. So, there's this idea, I think, in the world, particularly in the world of somatic therapies, that, we have this working window, this window of tolerance that people can operate inside of. And I think that model just doesn't work when it comes to psychedelic therapy because basically we're seeing that the psychedelic again, I would say supporting or putting a little bit of a rocket engine on the client's back, and they're able to encounter things and move through things that we just don't see in everyday
Mm.
therapy at all. So yeah, in a way it is, people are doing things that they I apologize for
No problem.
that they don't typically do. uh, and and what we find is that they can do it. So I mean, trauma is intense. It's called trauma for a reason.
Right.
It exists in the extremes, right? we have very highly activated states and very dissociative states where these traumatic events and memories rest inside of us. And I think it's those places that people are able to go to pretty successfully when it comes to working with psychedelics.
Are you able to kind of give us a little example of maybe one of your experiences with a client?
Okay. I'm happy to give you an example from me,
Okay.
because I was in Amsterdam working with psilocybin at a little pilot program that we had there. And during this period of time, my mother had been working, struggling with cancer for a number of years, and near the, it looked like we were coming near the end of that. And so I was being, I got the phone call saying it's time to come home, that kind of thing. So before I left, I had two clinicians that I'd met there walk me through my own psilocybin journey. And and the preface to this is that I was in an altered state already because I was in a dying process along with the family is in
Mhm.
an altered state when somebody, a loved one, is dying. And so basically we went in using psilocybin, and there's all sorts of different pieces to it, but I'll say that one important part that I realized. So, for example, one of the things that we see with psilocybin is that it takes very core experiences and turns them into this metaphoric image that your mind can then engage with. And so, I I saw this iceberg protruding from the center of my chest, and basically it was this visual representation of love that was never allowed. It was this frozen love. My mom had a fairly disturbed attachment style. I had a pretty avoidant attachment style, and so this very early primordial relationship in my life was marked by this inability to have this fluid experience of love. And so this manifested in the psilocybin journey as frozen love just sticking out of my chest. And of course this is kind of an interesting insight, but of course I think the real transformation doesn't happen at the level of insight. It happens at the level of the body. So basically at that point I could feel this frozenness in my chest, and it was very cold. And so then my body starts to get tight around it. I feel contractions moving through. um, uh, there's a physical pain I'm experiencing in my body. And all the while, my clinicians, I've I basically wrap them around me, so it's a tight container. They're holding me while I'm feeling this, and my body goes into these convulsions and
Wow.
contractions, and my jaw is tight. I'm breathing hard, and basically, I think it's processing the pain of this frozen love. So yeah, it can look something like that. Yeah.
Was that your first experience with psychedelics?
No, no, no. I had, to be in the MAPS trial, you have to have your own experience of psychedelics before you can provide that work
Sure.
to anybody else, because it is so radically different than anything that happens.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so,
And I
yeah.
so thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate this. Is all probably not easy to articulate and distill down to a soundbite, but who's a good candidate for this?
you know, okay, there's one way of describing that, which is, who are the clinical trials for? That we can describe it that way, right? But I would describe it in a much larger sense, right? So I think most people that engage in therapy would be a good candidate for this. So in other words, the people that we see in these clinical trials are not cherry-picked clients. They're treatment-resistant clients. They have really severe, complex early trauma. We see people at the clinical site at Innate Path and at PSI that have real attachment disorders. They have really early developmental traumas going on. So it's pretty significant stuff. And I would say that the psychedelics are most useful there because I think that's where traditional therapy is least helpful.
Hmm.
I would say that. But then the future of this that I see is where people who are not that severe can be using it for much easier things. And I think that, in fact, the healthier that somebody is, the further that they can go with a psychedelic medicine. Um, the only people that I would say right now that are not good candidates for this are people that have had a history of psychotic episodes, because the mind is shifted in a much more unstable direction temporarily during a psychedelic state. I'd say um, people that have a current instability in their life. You have to
Hmm.
be kind of stable and have resources and grounding to be able to go into this work. Um, Let me see who else is not a great candidate. Oh, I would say people with access to personality disorders, and that's not because I think psychedelics actually do have the capacity to work at that level. I've seen them work with people who at least have features of borderline personality disorder. It's just it's such an intense process that I think
Hmm.
most clinicians would not be ready to hold that in a container. I think that it would be really destructive in a way. So I would recommend for now, let's unfortunately not include that population. I think people need to the field has to mature a little bit more before we take on something that intense. And people who I would say are acutely suicidal. Like for example, at our clinical site, if somebody shows up and they're acutely disturbed or acutely suicidal, I would say go do an intravenous ketamine work, 6 sessions of that, stabilize a bit, and then show up here and we can maybe begin the psychedelic work. Oh, and of course, I would add like people that are newly in sobriety, right? Because again, all of what we're talking about pressurizes a person's system into movement, into a healing uh, journey. And if somebody is fresh to sobriety, um, they don't have the ego container. They don't have the ego integrity to really do that work. I think.
So you just said all of what you're doing kind of pressurizes people into a healing journey.
Yeah.
Why? Why? Why is it a healing journey? Why isn't it a chaotic journey or a
Yeah.
frightful journey?
Right. Well, it could be. I think healing journeys can be chaotic and frightful.
Mm,
Right. I don't think, again, when it comes to healing the core of somebody's structure, it's a much bigger process than their mind can orchestrate. Right. Then it's a bigger thing than typically, that we can figure out and strategize around or something like that. There's going to be times in it when, so for example, here's a good example, Guy, right? Most of the people that we work with who have trauma have a lot of dissociation covering up their trauma, right? And so when the dissociation clears, there what you see is a lot of fright. What you see is a lot of anxiety, high anxiety states. And I think there's no way around that.
hmm.
Right? And I would say that reactivity is part of the healing journey. And this is actually one of the reasons why I don't think we're going to see much addiction coming from people doing psychedelic therapy, simply because addiction is much more, you take something, you feel better for a little bit, there's no difficult part of it, there's no processing to it, and then it wears off and then you feel bad again. And I think with psychedelic therapy, you take something and you go into the lion's den, and and people do not do that lightly, right?
Hmm.
People do not take psychedelic therapy casually in any way. Yeah.
What role does the intention of the
Mm.
client play in this?
That's a great question. I'm going to say something that might be a little unpopular here, which is I don't think it plays much of a role at all. We want to think it does, and I think you can have intentions of saying, very generally speaking, like, I want to invite whatever this is into my life. I want to feel this. I don't want to hide from this anymore. I think you can do that. But there are, again, that's the client's conscious mind saying that. That's their
Right.
the tip of the iceberg saying that. They have far more forces inside of them that have a lot more to say about this than they're aware of. And what we typically find is that, even with something like cannabis, we had a pilot study with a group of combat veterans, and these were guys with enormous amounts of adult war trauma, and they had lots and lots of childhood trauma.
Mm.
And the medicine in combination with the cannabis in combination with their psyche would go far deeper than either they or the clinician would have imagined,
Mm.
right? So it really has a mind of its own, and that's both a good thing and a pitfall, right? Um, so again, with traditional therapy, you can really target things. You can say, "Oh, here's this car accident. We're going to work with this," or "Here's this one relationship.
Mm.
We're gonna work with that." And you kind of know the depth at which you're going. You don't with psychedelic therapy. It just goes where it goes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, this is fascinating. So where give us a general idea of where psychedelic therapy is
Mhm.
now.
Well, it's in a renaissance. There's a great deal, you may be aware, and your listeners may be aware, there's a great deal of research going on at major US universities. MDMA is in the second half of phase 3, so it's not that far away. Again, it's going to be an FDA medicalized kind of thing, so it's going to roll out in that network. But there's both corporations and states like Oregon that are working with to legalize psilocybin for therapy. So we are really at an amazing point here where more and more uh, we're going to have access to these medicines for mental health. And I think it's not just going to be Oregon that has legalized it for therapy. I think just like cannabis, other states are going to follow with
Right.
that. And then of course, if you consider that cannabis as a psychedelic, which I firmly do, we see it work in that way every day. Uh, I would say then people conceivably have access to psychedelic therapy over half the country already if it can be used in that context, right?
Well, Saj, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
They can, my email, Saj at psychedelicsomatic.org,
Okay.
or just go to the psychedelicsomatic.org website, and we have a lot of videos there. We have a link to the published article there. You'll get a lot more sense of what we think is actually going on here. We spent a lot of years kind of looking at how people are working, anecdotal experiences, and kind of formulating a model of what's going on. And it's mixed with some research. And I think it's a really good attempt to get at what this is going to look like.
In terms of training for people listening, therapists out there, students out there who are like, this sounds amazing. How do I learn about this? Where do you point them?
Yeah, well, there's a number of different training options in the world right now. So well, of course, we have our training, the PSI training, which again, it's designed to be implemented in a private practice setting. So you don't need two clinicians, you don't need a psychiatrist on board. If you live in a state where cannabis is medicinally or recreationally legal, you can work with that. You can also have a psychiatrist prescribe ketamine to be used in your private practice. So that's what we've really designed our program for. But outside of that, there's a couple of different formats that are available. So most of the trainings out there are what I would call the sitter or psychedelic integration model for therapists, where somebody hears about how powerful this work can be, and so they go off and have their own psychedelic experience, or they work in a ceremonial context, and then they find a therapist, and the therapist helps them integrate around
Mm-hmm.
what happened. So they're not doing the therapy during the session, but they're doing integration afterwards. And I think that's what a lot of like the CIIS program is fundamentally that, right? Now, the one other major program, of course, out there is MAPS, which is designed to give you access to working with MDMA when it finally does get approved. Um, and so I think those are really the big options right now.
Okay. And CIIS, that's California Institute of Integral Studies.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll have
Mhm.
that linked up. All right. So as we close out here, how about a go-to book recommendation?
I was thinking about, so I have a book that's being referred to me many times, so it makes me think that there's probably something significant here. The Presence Process. So I have not read it, so I can't say
Okay.
about it, but I've heard a lot of people say really good things about it in terms of if you're in the process, if you're working, it really helps you, gives you some guidelines with that. I tend to like things like the classics, like Drama of the Gifted Child. I think is a wonderful book to go back to. If you've never read it, it's great to pick up. It's very readable. And then I think the other one that's really important when we're talking about psychedelic therapy is anything really related to attachment. That comes up in a very big way here. So there's this big volume called Becoming Attached that I'm kind of fond of. It just goes through the world of attachment, what it looks like, and what the research is telling us about it. So I would say I give you 3.
Okay, awesome, awesome.
Any one of those.
Awesome. Well, awesome talking to you, man. This is fascinating, and I really appreciate you coming on here.
Great, thank you, Guy.
All right, so we'll be in touch.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.